It was just a portrait of a mother and her daughters, or at least that was how it appeared at first glance. The sort of image that archivists handled every day without a second thought, a quiet artifact among thousands that seemed to ask nothing of the person examining it, and yet something about this one resisted that anonymity from the moment Dr. James Mitchell's eyes settled on it, because even before he could articulate why, he felt the subtle but unmistakable sensation that this photograph was looking back at him with intention, as though it carried within it a knowledge that had been patiently waiting for someone to notice. And James, who had devoted more than 15 years of his life to the study of photographic archives at the New York Historical Society, had learned to trust that feeling, though he had rarely experienced it with such force. The portrait had arrived not as a prized acquisition or a carefully catalogued donation, but buried among dozens of other glass plate negatives inside a battered cardboard box delivered from an estate sale in Brooklyn, each fragile plate wrapped in yellowed newspaper whose brittle edges suggested it had not been touched since the early 20th century. The dates on the print faint but legible, 1923 appearing again and again like a quiet timestamp marking the last moment someone had considered these images important enough to protect. And as James carefully unwrapped them one by one in the conservation room, he found exactly what his experience told him he would find. Images that followed familiar patterns and conventions, stern-faced merchants posed rigidly behind counters, wedding parties arranged in stiff symmetry, children dressed in their best Sunday clothes and instructed to remain absolutely still, the visual grammar of the late 19th century repeating itself faithfully across plate after plate, until his hands paused mid-motion over one image that seemed to break those rules without obviously defying them, because at first glance it looked entirely conventional, a formal studio portrait of 3 women posed against a painted garden backdrop, the kind of scene that had been mass-produced by photographers of the era, and yet something about it stopped him cold, a subtle wrongness that did not announce itself loudly, but insisted on being acknowledged, compelling him to set the other negatives aside and lift this one closer to the light, where the figures emerged with startling clarity. A mother perhaps around 40 years old seated at the center in an ornate wooden chair, her posture straight and composed, her expression calm but resolute, flanked by her daughters, young women likely in their late teens or early 20s, standing on either side with one hand resting gently on their mother's shoulders, all 3 African American, all 3 dressed in their finest clothing, high-collared dresses rendered in deep, rich tones that spoke of careful selection and expense, intricate lacework at the cuffs and collars, fabric pressed and tailored with precision, hair styled deliberately, every element communicating dignity, intention, and self-respect. And none of that alone was unusual enough to justify James's reaction, because he had catalogued countless portraits of black families from the period who had sought, through photography, to assert their humanity and status in a society determined to deny both. But what held his gaze, what made his pulse slow and his focus narrow, was not their faces or their clothing, or even the solemn grace with which they met the camera's eye, but their hands, which at first appeared simply folded or placed in expected positions, until he noticed the exact configuration of the fingers, the mother's hands resting in her lap not loosely but arranged in a precise and somewhat uncomfortable-looking pattern, her right thumb deliberately crossing over her left, her index and middle fingers extended while the remaining fingers curled inward in a way that would require conscious effort to maintain, especially during the long exposure times demanded by photographic technology in 1892, and when his eyes moved to the daughter's hands, he felt a quiet shock of recognition, because each daughter's hand, though placed naturally on her mother's shoulder, mirrored variations of the same deliberate structure, fingers bent at careful angles, thumbs positioned with intention rather than ease, and James knew, with the certainty that comes from long familiarity, that this was not coincidence, because Victorian-era photography did not allow for accidental gestures. Subjects were instructed to remain absolutely still, sometimes for several minutes, and any position that required muscular tension had to be consciously chosen and deliberately held, which meant that these hand positions were intentional in a way that transcended aesthetics, prompting James to retrieve a magnifying glass and examine the glass plate more closely, tracing the etched lines and subtle shadows until he noticed, almost hidden in the bottom right corner, a tiny sequence of numbers scratched directly into the glass itself, NY 1,892,247, a detail so faint it would have been invisible in a standard print, yet unmistakable once seen, and that small discovery lodged itself in his mind with a persistence that would not be dismissed. Following him home that evening, as he returned to his Upper West Side apartment, where he spread his notebooks, reference texts, and digital equipment across the dining table and uploaded the high-resolution image he had captured earlier, the portrait now filling his laptop screen in such clarity that the texture of the fabric became visible, the fine weave of lace discernible, the small brooch pinned to the mother's collar catching the light, even the subtle differences in bone structure between the daughters emerging clearly. Yet none of those details held his attention for long, because his eyes kept returning to the hands, and he zoomed in further and further until each fingerful led the frame, the deliberate crossing of the mother's thumbs now impossible to dismiss, the extended fingers forming a shape that felt symbolic rather than expressive. And as he stared, his mind turned instinctively to his earlier research into Civil War photography, Reconstruction-era documentation practices, and the visual language of early social reform movements, recalling how activists had long used subtle signals embedded in images, poses, clothing, and objects to communicate information to those who knew how to read them, while remaining invisible to hostile observers. And that realization led him to open his digital archive of abolitionist networks, mutual aid societies, and post-emancipation organizations, though he quickly understood that this photograph did not belong to the era of the Underground Railroad, whose quilt patterns and coded songs had become well known, because this image dated to 1892, nearly 3 decades after the Emancipation Proclamation, and 15 years after the formal end of Reconstruction, raising a troubling and compelling question about who, in that later period, still needed to communicate in coded ways and what they were trying to protect, a question that lingered unanswered until his phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Sarah Chen, a colleague and close collaborator whose expertise in African American history complemented his own archival focus, replying to his earlier text with a simple inquiry, "Free tomorrow morning?" "What did you find?" To which James responded without hesitation, something that might rewrite what we know about post-Reconstruction activism in New York. "Bring your sources on property rights and documentation struggles." And when Sarah arrived at the Historical Society the next morning precisely at 9 o'clock, carrying a worn leather satchel heavy with books, photocopies, and handwritten notes, James had already prepared the research room, dimming the lights and projecting the portrait onto the wall at a scale that rendered the 3 women nearly life-sized, their gaze now commanding the space with quiet authority. And when James gestured toward their hands and explained his suspicions, Sarah approached slowly, her expression shifting from polite curiosity to focused intensity, as she examined the image more closely, before setting her bag down and spreading her materials across the table, beginning to outline the historical context that would soon transform James's intuition into something far more concrete, explaining that after the collapse of Reconstruction in 1877, African American families in the North encountered a new and insidious form of resistance, not overt enslavement, but systematic exclusion through legal mechanisms that denied them property rights, inheritance claims, business licenses, and even the ability to prove their own identities, particularly for families who had fled the South without official documents, no birth certificates, no marriage licenses, no recognized records of ownership. And as she spoke, she laid out legal papers, city records, and newspaper clippings from the 1880s and 1890s that illustrated case after case of black families losing property or being denied rights due to insufficient documentation, reminding James that New York, often mythologized as a progressive refuge, was in reality a city where black residents faced constant bureaucratic hostility. And when James picked up a yellowed newspaper from 1891 bearing the headline "Property Dispute in Harlem, Family Claims Ownership Without Documentation," Sarah nodded and explained that she had been researching the rise of mutual aid societies during this period, organizations formed within African American communities to navigate these exclusionary systems by pooling resources. HIRIN. Sympathetic lawyers, sharing information about cooperative officials, and in some cases creating their own parallel systems of verification when official channels refused to acknowledge their existence, prompting James to quietly observe that what she was describing sounded like secret networks, though Sarah corrected him gently, saying they were not secret in the sense of hidden conspiracies but parallel structures, operating openly within the community while remaining largely invisible or unintelligible to white authorities, who did not think to look for meaning in the places where it was encoded, and that distinction caused James to turn back toward the projected portrait with a new understanding, wondering aloud whether this photograph was not merely a family keepsake but a form of documentation itself, a hypothesis that gained traction when the etched number on the glass plate led them, after 2 days of careful searching through city directories and business registries, to a photographer named Thomas Wright, whose Studio 247 operated on 8th Avenue between 1888 and 1896, an address that still existed though the building had long since been converted into residential apartments. And when James stood on the sidewalk looking up at the brick facade, imagining the second-floor studio with its large north-facing windows designed to capture soft, even light, he began to see the photograph not as an isolated artifact, but as part of a broader system, a realization reinforced by further research into Wright himself, who turned out to be a white photographer born in Massachusetts in 1851, trained in Boston, and relocated to New York in 1887, where he established his studio in a neighborhood undergoing rapid demographic change. Yet unlike most white photographers of the era, who either refused black clients outright or charged them exploitative rates, Wright advertised in African American newspapers and welcomed clients of all backgrounds at equal prices, even giving an interview to a small progressive paper in 1894 in which he described photography as a tool for dignity and documentation and argued that every person deserved a quality portrait regardless of their social standing, prompting Sarah to identify him as an ally whose quiet activism might explain the deliberate nature of the hand positions, suggesting that if these gestures were codes, Wright would have been instrumental not only in documenting them, but in teaching families how to pose, an idea that led James to contact Dr. Marcus Thompson, a cryptography historian at Columbia University, whose arrival that afternoon marked the next stage of their investigation, as Marcus examined the portrait and explained that Victorian-era codes were often far more practical than modern observers assumed, designed not for complexity but for reliability within a specific context, leading the three researchers to spend hours photographing, tracing, and comparing hand positions across multiple images, eventually concluding that the gestures likely represented categories or statuses rather than letters, a system efficient enough to be learned by ordinary people, yet subtle enough to escape notice. And as Sarah connected this theory to her research on identity verification struggles, suggesting that the mother's hand position might signify her role as a guarantor or family head, while the daughter's positions indicated their documentation status, James felt the first clear sense that they were uncovering something vast, something carefully constructed and intentionally concealed, a realization that deepened when additional portraits from the same estate box revealed similar hand arrangements across different families, couples, and individuals, always subtle, always deliberate, leading Marcus to conclude that this was not a single isolated code, but a flexible system taught to families, documented by photographers, and readable by network members, setting the stage for discoveries that would soon transform a single portrait into evidence of an entire hidden infrastructure built to protect dignity, identity, and survival in a society determined to deny all three. That realization lingered in the room like a held breath, because once the possibility of a system was acknowledged, every element they had examined so far seemed to rearrange itself into a coherent pattern, and James felt the unmistakable sensation that comes when scattered facts begin to align into an explanation that is both unsettling and inevitable, prompting him to return to the estate box and re-examine the remaining glass plate negatives with a new level of scrutiny, this time not looking for faces or dates, but for hands, posture, repetition, and subtle consistencies, and as he laid them out across the long archival table under even light, the pattern became impossible to ignore, because again and again, amid otherwise conventional Victorian portraits, he found fingers arranged with deliberate tension, thumbs crossing in non-resting positions, digits extended or curled in ways that would never be chosen for comfort, always understated enough to appear accidental to an untrained eye, yet unmistakably intentional once recognized. And Sarah, standing beside him, began taking careful notes, mapping similarities, cataloging variations, while Marcus worked quietly at his laptop, tracing gestures digitally and overlaying them to identify shared structures, eventually breaking the silence by pointing out that the system appeared modular, meaning that a limited number of finger configurations could be combined or mirrored to convey different information. A design choice that made sense for a network that needed to be scalable, teachable, and resilient against partial loss of knowledge. And as the afternoon wore on, James noticed that many of the photographs shared another subtle feature. A barely visible number etched into the glass plate, sometimes in the corner, sometimes along the edge, always faint but consistent in style, suggesting a standardized cataloging method. And when he cross-referenced these numbers with Thomas Wright's surviving business records, he found ledger entries that matched the sequences, dates, and client counts, indicating that Wright had been systematically recording these sessions not merely as commercial transactions, but as part of an organized archive. A discovery that reframed Wright's role entirely, transforming him from a sympathetic service provider into an active participant in a coordinated effort. A conclusion Sarah supported when she uncovered additional advertisements Wright had placed in African-American newspapers that emphasized not just affordability but discretion, dignity, and permanence, language that took on new meaning in light of the emerging evidence. And as the three researchers began to consider who else might have been involved, Sarah recalled her earlier work on black legal advocacy in late 19th century New York, and suggested examining court records for attorneys who had an unusually high success rate in cases involving African-American clients, particularly those related to property disputes, inheritance claims, and identity verification. A suggestion that led James to spend the next 2 days immersed in dusty volumes of court transcripts and legal filings, where one name surfaced again and again with striking consistency: Robert Hayes, an attorney practicing out of an office on West 34th Street, whose case history showed a pattern of victories that defied the statistical norms of the era, especially given the racial bias of the courts. And when James compiled a list of Hayes's cases and compared them to Wright's photographic records, the overlap was unmistakable, with multiple families appearing both in Wright's ledgers and in Hayes's legal filings, often within months of one another, suggesting a direct pipeline between photographic documentation and legal advocacy. A theory confirmed when Sarah located archived correspondence in the New York Public Library between Hayes and various community leaders, including ministers, teachers, and aid society organizers, letters that discussed verification protocols, family registries, and visual confirmations, language that would have seemed innocuous without context, but now read like technical documentation for a parallel system of identity validation. And among these letters, one dated March 1893 stood out for its clarity, as Hayes wrote to a minister in Brooklyn about the expansion of their photographic documentation to include 73 families, noting that Mr. Wright continued to provide his services at minimal cost, and that the hand positioning system allowed essential information to be encoded in a manner that could be verified later, each portrait serving both as dignified representation and practical identification, a sentence that caused James to sit back in stunned silence, because it confirmed not only the existence of the system, but its intentional design and coordinated implementation, revealing that what they had uncovered was not a series of isolated acts of resistance, but an entire parallel infrastructure built in response to systemic exclusion. And as Sarah absorbed the implications, she articulated what James had been struggling to put into words, that when official America refused to document Black lives with accuracy and fairness, these communities documented themselves, using the tools available to them and hiding their work in plain sight, embedding it within familiar cultural forms like family portraits and church records, so that it could survive scrutiny and time. A realization that reframed every photograph they had examined, not as a passive image, but as an active participant in a larger effort to preserve rights, dignity, and continuity. And with that understanding, James became increasingly determined to identify the individuals in the original portrait that had sparked the investigation, believing that their story might serve as a key to understanding how the network functioned on a personal level, a task that led him back to the donor records associated with the Brooklyn estate sale, where he found the name Patricia Johnson listed as the seller, along with an address in Bedford-Stuyvesant, a neighborhood with deep African-American roots. And after some hesitation, James decided to call her, uncertain how she would respond to inquiries about old family photographs. But when she answered, her voice sharp and guarded at first, he carefully described the portrait in detail, and something in his description shifted her tone, prompting her to identify the mother as her great-grandmother, Eleanor Morrison, and the daughters as her grandmother Ruth and great-aunt Grace, names that immediately took on new significance. And as James asked gentle questions about Eleanor's life, Patricia explained that Eleanor had been born enslaved in Virginia, migrated north after the Civil War with infant Ruth, and later gave birth to Grace in New York, supporting her family as a seamstress known for her exceptional lacework, a detail that resonated with James given the intricate fabric visible in the portrait. And when he asked whether Eleanor had been involved in community organizations, Patricia paused before explaining that family law described her as someone who helped people, assisting with paperwork, housing, and connections to lawyers, though the specifics had been lost over time, prompting James to share his theory about the documentation network, a revelation that left Patricia silent for several moments, before she spoke again with emotion evident in her voice, acknowledging that she had always known Eleanor was special, but that much of that history had faded as the family dispersed after her death in 1919, and with Patricia's permission, James and Sarah began tracing Eleanor's connections through church records, aid society minutes, and community registries, discovering that she had been an active member of Bethel Church in Brooklyn from 1879 until her death, serving on the Ladies' Aid Society, which officially provided charity to families in need, but whose meeting minutes revealed a more structured operation beneath the surface, including careful lists of families assisted, annotated with numbers and symbols that initially seemed arbitrary until Sarah recognized their correspondence to Wright's photographic numbering system, revealing a cross-referencing mechanism that linked church aid records to photographic documentation, legal advocacy, and community verification, a system that allowed families to be identified, supported, and defended without ever appearing overtly subversive. And as James traced these connections outward, he uncovered additional network members, including a schoolteacher named Samuel Brooks, who helped children obtain school records when administrators refused them, a clerk in the city property office named Mary Chen, who ensured deeds were properly filed and processed, and a minister named Reverend James Washington, who performed marriages and issued certificates when official channels denied recognition, each individual occupying a position that allowed them to quietly intervene within a hostile system, taking calculated risks to protect families whose existence the law sought to erase. And together they formed what James came to think of as a shadow archive, an informal yet meticulously organized record of lives, relationships, and rights that official institutions refused to acknowledge. And as the scope of the network became clearer, James and Sarah recognized the importance of sharing their findings with the public, not only to correct the historical record, but to honor the individuals who had participated in this quiet resistance, leading them to propose an exhibition at the Historical Society that would display a selection of Wright's photographs alongside the stories they had uncovered, an idea that gained swift approval given the significance of the discovery. And over the next several months, they worked to curate the exhibition, selecting 20 portraits that best illustrated the hand positioning system and the diversity of families it served, writing explanatory texts that balanced scholarly rigor with narrative clarity, and reaching out to descendants whenever possible to include their voices, a process that brought unexpected moments of connection and revelation, as families shared oral histories, letters, and documents that suddenly made sense within the context of the network. And when the exhibition finally opened, Patricia Johnson attended with her daughter and granddaughter, standing before Eleanor Morrison's portrait, alongside 3 generations of her family, a moment that embodied the continuity the network had sought to preserve. But the exhibition's impact extended far beyond any single family as other descendants arrived, including Thomas Hayes, great-grandson of Robert Hayes, who expressed astonishment at the scale of his ancestors' involvement, and Grace Brooks, descendant of Samuel Brooks, who reinterpreted family stories of his arrest in 1895, not as evidence of wrongdoing, but as proof of his commitment to justice. And as word of the exhibition spread, historians from across the country contacted James and Sarah with reports of similar networks uncovered in Philadelphia, Boston, and Chicago, all operating during the same period and employing comparable strategies of coded photography and community documentation, suggesting a broader movement that had gone largely unrecognized by mainstream historical narratives. And 6 months after first encountering the portrait, James found himself once again in the conservation lab, carefully handling the restored glass plate negative that had started everything, reflecting on how Eleanor Morrison, born enslaved, had used the tools available to her to build a life of dignity and purpose, helping countless families navigate systems designed to exclude them, and how her deliberate hand positioning in that Brooklyn studio in 1892 had carried a message across more than a century, a message finally received, understood, and honored, reminding him that history often hides its most powerful stories in the smallest details, waiting patiently for someone willing to look closely enough to see them. That recognition did not bring closure so much as it opened a deeper corridor of inquiry, because once James understood that the portrait was not merely an image but a node in a living system, he could no longer see it as a static artifact, and in the weeks that followed he found himself returning to it again and again, not out of habit, but out of a growing sense of responsibility, as though the photograph itself demanded to be fully understood on its own terms, prompting him and Sarah to broaden their research beyond New York and into the social, legal, and cultural mechanics that would have made such a network not only necessary but viable. And as they immersed themselves in correspondence, sermons, meeting minutes, and marginalia tucked into unrelated collections, they began to see how the late 19th century, often framed in textbooks as a period of industrial expansion and urban modernization, was simultaneously an era of tightening exclusion for African American families whose freedom existed largely in theory while being undermined in practice by bureaucratic gatekeeping, discretionary enforcement, and the quiet erosion of rights through paperwork, or the lack of it, a reality that made documentation not just a matter of record but of survival. And this understanding clarified why a system built around photography made such sense, because photographs occupied a unique space in that period, simultaneously personal and official, emotional and evidentiary, trusted by courts as representations of identity, while remaining accessible to ordinary families, allowing them to serve as both memory and proof. And James began to appreciate the subtle brilliance of embedding code, information, into something as culturally normalized as a family portrait, because it ensured that the system could operate in plain sight without arousing suspicion, a strategy that relied on the prejudices of the dominant society, which did not imagine that black families possessed the organizational capacity or foresight to build such infrastructures. And in that blindness, the network found its protection, a realization that deepened when Sarah uncovered sermons delivered by Reverend James Washington that spoke in metaphorical language about keeping records in the hands of God when the world refuses to write your name, phrases that had once seemed purely spiritual but now read as veiled encouragement for participation in the documentation effort. And as James traced the distribution of Wright's photographs, he noticed that many appeared in multiple copies, one likely kept by the family, another retained by Wright, and a third sometimes referenced indirectly in legal filings, suggesting a redundancy designed to safeguard against loss, theft, or destruction, which was not a theoretical concern given the frequency with which Black families' documents were discarded, challenged, or ignored, and this redundancy explained why the hand positioning system had to be simple enough to be reliably reproduced across sessions and decades, yet specific enough to encode meaningful distinctions, a balance that Marcus later described as elegant under constraint. And as the researchers reconstructed the logic of the system, they began to tentatively map its components, identifying gestures that appeared to indicate marital status, number of dependents, place of origin, and verification by trusted community members, none of which could be definitively proven in isolation but which gained credibility through repetition and correlation with known outcomes, such as successful court cases or property claims. And James was particularly struck by how the system appeared to privilege collective validation over individual assertion, emphasizing relationships and endorsements rather than solitary identity, a design choice that reflected the communal ethos of mutual aid societies and countered a legal framework that often demanded isolated proof from individuals, deliberately denied the means to produce it. And this communal emphasis became even clearer when Sarah located records from the Ladies' Aid Society showing that families were often photographed in clusters over short periods, suggesting coordinated efforts to document entire neighborhoods or congregations. And when James plotted these sessions against periods of increased legal challenges or policy changes, he found correlations that suggested the network responded dynamically to external pressures, mobilizing resources when threats intensified, a level of strategic awareness that contradicted simplistic narratives of post-Reconstruction Black life as reactive or disorganized. And as the scope of the project expanded, James found himself fielding inquiries from younger scholars and graduate students, drawn to the implications of the discovery, many of whom were eager to reinterpret familiar events through this new lens. And though the attention was gratifying, it also reinforced James's sense that the story needed to be told carefully, resisting the temptation to romanticize or oversimplify the network's work, because while it represented ingenuity and resilience, it did not eliminate injustice, and many families undoubtedly fell through its gaps, a reality that weighed on him as he reviewed case files where photographic evidence failed to sway judges or where victories were partial and fragile, reminding him that the network's existence was a response to oppression, not a solution to it. And nuance became central to the exhibition narrative, which James and Sarah refined through multiple drafts to ensure that visitors understood both the power and the limits of the system, framing it as an act of collective self-defense rather than a triumphalist workaround. And when the exhibition opened to broader media attention following the initial local coverage, the New York Times article that ran under the headline, "Hidden in Plain Sight: How Post-Reconstruction Activists Built a Secret Documentation Network," sparked a wave of public interest that extended beyond academic circles, prompting descendants across the country to search their own family collections for similar photographs. And as images poured in, James and Sarah recognized familiar hand positions appearing in unexpected places, sometimes in rural contexts, sometimes decades later than Wright's studio had operated, suggesting that the system, or at least its underlying logic, had diffused beyond its original geographic and temporal boundaries, adapted by communities facing analogous challenges. And this diffusion raised new questions about how knowledge traveled within marginalized networks, through churches, schools, family connections, and informal mentorship, channels that left little trace in official archives but shaped lived experience profoundly. And as James engaged with these emerging threads, he became increasingly aware of the emotional weight of the work, particularly during conversations with descendants who described a sense of validation upon learning that their ancestors' struggles had been part of a larger, purposeful effort rather than isolated misfortune, moments that reminded him that archives were not neutral repositories but sites of memory, whose interpretation could alter how people understood their own histories. And this awareness shaped his approach to the Conservation Lab, Here the physical care of Wright's glass plate negatives took on symbolic importance, as each plate represented not just an image, but a testament to intentional preservation, and as conservators stabilized emulsions, repaired cracks, and digitized the images at high resolution. James observed the process with reverence, knowing that the act of preservation mirrored the original intent of the network, extending its protective reach into the present. And when Patricia Johnson later donated Eleanor Morrison's personal papers to the Historical Society, including letters, a diary, and business records from her seamstress work, the written word added depth to the visual record, particularly when James encountered the diary entry in which Eleanor described the day of the photograph, noting that Mr. Wright was a kind man who understood what they were building, that the girls were nervous, but that she believed the picture would matter someday, a passage that sent a quiet shiver through James, because it demonstrated a self-awareness that bridged centuries, confirming that Eleanor understood her participation as part of a historical act rather than a private moment. And as Sarah continued tracing the network's reach, she compiled a database documenting 63 families whose interactions with the system could be reasonably reconstructed, noting how they obtained property deeds, legal marriages, business licenses, and school records through coordinated advocacy. Evidence that the network had operated continuously from approximately 1888 to 1897, before gradually dissolving as key figures died, moved away, or as new institutional pathways emerged, and this temporal framing helped James contextualize the network not as a timeless underground, but as a historically specific response to a particular configuration of oppression, one that adapted to its moment and then gave way to other forms of resistance. And in conversations with contemporary activists, James began to see parallels between the network's strategies and modern efforts to document marginalized lives through community archives, oral history projects, and digital storytelling, reinforcing the idea that while the tools change, the underlying need to assert presence and legitimacy persists. And as he reflected on the portrait once more, he understood that its enduring power lay not only in its revelation of a hidden system, but in its embodiment of a broader truth, that resistance does not always announce itself through grand gestures or public declarations, but often through quiet, meticulous acts of care, coordination and foresight carried out by ordinary people who understand that survival requires both visibility and discretion. And as James stood alone in the gallery after hours, the lights dimmed and the portraits glowing softly against the walls, he found his eyes drawn again to Eleanor Morrison's hands, arranged deliberately in that Brooklyn studio more than a century earlier, fingers forming a code that transcended its immediate purpose to become a symbol of collective memory, a reminder that history's most profound truths are sometimes hidden not because they are forbidden, but because they are entrusted to those who know how to hold them. And yet, even as James felt the narrative settling into something that resembled completion, he understood that an ending, in the conventional sense, would be dishonest to the nature of what they had uncovered, because the network they had revealed was never designed to culminate in recognition or closure. It existed to solve immediate problems, to preserve lives in motion, and then to fade quietly when circumstances changed, leaving behind traces that only later generations might piece together. And this realization reshaped Ho. W. James chose to frame the final phase of the work, shifting his focus away from definitive conclusions and toward continuity, toward the ways in which the logic of the network persisted even after its formal dissolution, embedded in habits, expectations, and family stories that survived long after the original participants were gone. And as he continued interviewing descendants, he noticed a recurring pattern in their recollections, a shared memory of elders who emphasized the importance of keeping records, saving photographs, writing names carefully in family Bibles, and teaching children to remember where they came from, practices that had often been dismissed as simple caution or nostalgia, but which now appeared as cultural echoes of a time when documentation was a form of defense. And these echoes reinforced James's growing belief that the network's greatest achievement was not any single legal victory or preserved property deed, but the cultivation of a mindset that treated self-documentation as an act of agency, a belief that one's life was worthy of being recorded even when official systems refused to do so. And this belief, passed quietly from generation to generation, became a kind of inheritance in itself, shaping how families understood their place in history. And as James reflected on this, he realized that the portrait of Elelana Morrison and her daughters functioned on multiple levels simultaneously, as a practical tool within a specific historical system, as a personal family keepsake, and as a symbolic artifact that carried forward an ethic of resistance rooted in care rather than confrontation. And this multiplicity explained why the image continued to resonate so deeply with viewers, even those encountering it without full knowledge of the hand positioning system, because there was something in the women's composure, in the deliberate stillness of their bodies, that communicated resolve without aggression, purpose without spectacle. And as the exhibition traveled to other institutions, sparking new research initiatives and collaborative projects, James found himself increasingly positioned not as the discoverer of a hidden story, but as a steward of a conversation that belonged to many voices, a role he accepted with humility, recognizing that the archive was not a static repository, but a living space shaped by those who engaged with it. And this perspective guided his decision to make the digitized photographs publicly accessible, accompanied by contextual essays and open invitations for descendants and scholars to contribute additional information, a choice that reflected the original network's emphasis on collective knowledge rather than proprietary control. And as new submissions arrived, some tentative, others richly detailed, James saw the archive expand in ways he could not have predicted, revealing additional links, corroborating hypotheses, and occasionally challenging assumptions, a process that underscored the importance of remaining open to revision, especially when working with histories shaped by exclusion and erasure. And in moments of quiet reflection, James often returned to the conservation lab where the original glass plate negative was stored, not out of obligation but out of gratitude, because it was there, holding that fragile object, that he felt most acutely the continuity between past and present, the sense that his own work was an extension of the same impulse that had guided Elelana Morrison and her peers, an impulse to preserve what mattered against the eroding forces of neglect and denial. And he thought often of Thomas Wright, whose role as an ally had been both crucial and understated, a reminder that solidarity sometimes takes the form of technical skill offered without fanfare, and of Robert Hayes, whose legal acumen had been deployed not for personal advancement but for communal protection, and of the countless unnamed individuals whose participation had left only faint traces, a gesture here, a notation there, yet whose collective effort had sustained families through one of the most precarious periods of American history. And as James prepared the final report summarizing the research, he resisted the temptation to frame the network as exceptional or anomalous, choosing instead to situate it within a broader tradition of Black self-organization that had emerged wherever exclusion demanded ingenuity, emphasizing that such systems were not aberrations but logical responses to structural injustice. And this framing resonated with audiences who recognized parallels in contemporary struggles over documentation, citizenship, and belonging, prompting discussions that bridged historical scholarship and present-day advocacy. And in these conversations, James often found himself returning to the image of the hands, because it was there that the entire story converged, in a gesture that was simultaneously intimate and strategic, personal and political, simple in appearance yet dense with meaning. And he began to see the hand positioning not merely as a code to be deciphered, but as a metaphor for the work itself, a reminder that history is often held together by small, deliberate actions, repeated with care, actions that may go unnoticed in their moment but accumulate significance over time. And as the years passed and the initial excitement of the discovery gave way to sustained engagement, James took comfort in the knowledge that the portrait's journey had come full circle, returning from obscurity to visibility, from private memory to shared understanding, fulfilling Elelana Morrison's quiet conviction that the picture would matter someday. And he thought of her standing in Thomas Wright's studio in 1892, arranging her hands just so, instructing her daughters to do the same. He no longer imagined her as posing for a photograph, but as participating in a deliberate act of historical inscription, placing herself and her family into a record that refused to exclude them. And in that understanding, James found the true ending of the story, not in closure or resolution, but in continuity, in the recognition that the simplest gestures can carry the weight of generations, and that sometimes the most profound truths are not hidden because they are secret, but because they are entrusted to those who know how to look closely, patiently, and with care, until at last they are ready to be seen.